On live daytime television, a calm conversation can shift faster than anyone expects. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Not because anyone planned it that way, but because two strong perspectives meet in real time in front of a studio audience. That was the feeling many viewers had when Leonardo DiCaprio appeared on a daytime talk show similar to The View, sitting across from a panel that included Sunny Hostin. And what began as a measured discussion slowly shifted into a firmer, more serious exchange that caught the attention of everyone watching. Before we walk through exactly how that unfolded, make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage, because moments like this are why so many people tune in to live television in the first place. The segment itself was introduced in a way that felt familiar to regular viewers of daytime talk shows. The hosts welcomed Leonardo DiCaprio to the table, acknowledging his long career in film and his continued work as an environmental advocate. The tone at the beginning was calm and respectful, almost conversational, with the host smiling, leaning forward, and setting up what sounded like a thoughtful discussion rather than a debate. DiCaprio appeared relaxed but attentive, sitting upright, hands loosely folded at times, clearly prepared to talk about his current projects and the causes he often speaks about publicly. Sunny Hostin opened her part of the conversation by framing the discussion around responsibility and influence. Her delivery was steady and professional, the way viewers expect from someone used to guiding serious conversations on live TV. She referenced DiCaprio's activism and the way public figures shape conversations around climate change, social responsibility, and public policy. At this stage, there was no tension in the room. The other hosts nodded along, occasionally adding brief affirmations or clarifying remarks, and the audience remained quiet, listening closely. DiCaprio responded in a measured tone, thanking the panel for having him and explaining how he views his role as someone with a public platform. He spoke carefully, choosing words that reflected long-held positions he has shared in interviews before. His body language suggested focus rather than defensiveness. He made eye contact with Sunny Hostin as she spoke, a sign that he was engaged and taking her points seriously, not brushing them aside. As the conversation continued, Sunny Hostin gradually shifted from general observations to more pointed questions. She raised the issue of consistency, asking how celebrities balance advocacy with the realities of their lifestyles and careers. Her tone did not change dramatically, but viewers familiar with talk shows could sense the pivot. This was no longer just a friendly exchange of ideas. It was a thoughtful challenge, delivered calmly but directly. DiCaprio paused slightly before answering, a moment that stood out on live television because it suggested he was choosing his words carefully. When he did respond, his voice remained calm, but there was a firmness to it that hadn't been there before. He acknowledged the complexity of the issue and explained that progress, in his view, often comes through imperfect steps rather than ideal conditions. The studio audience remained quiet, the kind of silence that indicates close attention rather than discomfort. Sunny Hostin followed up, clarifying her point and emphasizing accountability. She spoke about how viewers at home often look to public figures not just for statements, but for examples they can relate to. Her posture leaned slightly forward, hands resting on the table, signaling engagement rather than confrontation. Still, the exchange was becoming more serious, and the other hosts began to shift in their seats, sensing that the conversation was moving into more challenging territory. DiCaprio responded again, this time with a clearer edge of resolve. He reiterated that while scrutiny is fair, it's also important to recognize the broader impact of advocacy efforts. His words were deliberate, and his expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in concentration. To an audience member watching live, it was evident that he felt strongly about what he was saying and wanted to make sure his point was understood without escalating the tone. One of the other hosts briefly interjected, offering a transitional comment that acknowledged both perspectives. This is a common technique on daytime talk shows, used to keep conversations balanced and prevent them from tipping into outright arguments. The interjection was short, and the conversation quickly returned to Sunny Hostin and DiCaprio, who were now clearly the focal point of the segment. Sunny Hostin nodded as DiCaprio spoke, then raised one more question that brought the discussion closer to policy and public expectations. Her voice remained even, but the content was more direct. She asked whether public advocacy sometimes risks oversimplifying complex issues, especially when communicated through celebrity platforms. This question marked a subtle but noticeable escalation, not in volume or emotion, but in substance. DiCaprio's response was the moment many viewers later pointed to as the point where he responded firmly. He did not raise his voice or interrupt, but his posture straightened, and his words became more precise. He explained that his intention has always been to amplify expert voices rather than replace them, and that public engagement, even when imperfect, can lead to broader awareness and action. His delivery was confident and controlled, suggesting he was drawing from years of experience having similar conversations in public forums. The studio audience reacted with light applause at the end of his response, a brief but noticeable reaction that indicated appreciation rather than taking sides. Sunny Hostin acknowledged the applause with a small nod, then responded by thanking him for clarifying his position. Her tone softened slightly, signaling that the exchange, while serious, was not personal or hostile. As part one of the segment continued, the overall atmosphere remained respectful but undeniably more intense than when it began. The hosts maintained their professional composure, occasionally glancing at each other as if silently coordinating how to guide the conversation forward. DiCaprio remained engaged, occasionally gesturing lightly with his hands to emphasize points, but always returning them to rest on the table, a sign of restraint rather than agitation. For viewers watching live, this part of the conversation felt like a genuine moment of dialogue rather than a manufactured clash. It showed how live television can shift naturally when thoughtful questions meet equally thoughtful, but firm, responses. The disagreement was not about personalities, but about perspectives, and that distinction was clear in the way both Sunny Hostin and Leonardo DiCaprio conducted themselves. As the segment moved toward its next phase, there was a sense that the groundwork had been laid for further discussion. The audience remained attentive, the hosts prepared to broaden the conversation, and DiCaprio appeared ready to continue engaging with the panel. What started as a routine interview had clearly become something more substantive, setting the stage for the deeper exchange that would follow as the show continued. As the conversation moved forward from that initial exchange, the tone in the studio subtly shifted again, not toward conflict, but toward deeper focus. Viewers watching live could sense that this was no longer a surface-level interview. The hosts adjusted their pacing, allowing slightly longer pauses between questions and answers, something that often happens when a discussion begins to carry more weight. Leonardo DiCaprio remained composed, but his attention was clearly fixed on the panel, especially on Sunny Hostin, whose line of questioning continued to guide the direction of the segment. Sunny Hostin transitioned by acknowledging DiCaprio's clarification, then expanding the conversation to how media narratives shape public understanding. Her voice stayed steady, but the framing of her question suggested a broader concern about influence, responsibility, and perception. She spoke in a way that felt familiar to regular viewers of daytime talk shows. Thoughtful, deliberate, and rooted in the idea that conversations on television don't end when the cameras cut. They ripple outward to millions of viewers at home. DiCaprio listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding as she spoke. When he responded, he began by agreeing with part of her premise, which slightly eased the tension in the room. Agreeing, even partially, is often a signal on talk shows that a guest is engaging in good faith rather than preparing for confrontation. He explained that media narratives can sometimes flatten complex issues, but he also emphasized that silence from public figures can be just as influential, sometimes in less productive ways. As he spoke, one of the co-hosts leaned in and added a brief comment, reinforcing the idea that viewers often want both honesty and humility from well-known figures. This interjection served as a bridge, momentarily widening the conversation beyond the two main voices. The audience responded with quiet murmurs of agreement, the kind that don't disrupt the broadcast but add texture to the live atmosphere. Sunny Hostin then returned to the discussion, gently steering it back toward accountability. She referenced moments in the past where celebrity advocacy faced criticism, not naming specific incidents, but speaking in general terms that viewers could easily connect to real-world examples. Her delivery was careful, avoiding accusation, but her point was clear. Visibility comes with expectations, and audiences are increasingly vocal when they feel those expectations aren't met. DiCaprio's response reflected a noticeable shift in firmness. His tone remained calm, but there was less hedging in his language. He stated clearly that he does not claim to be perfect and does not expect others to see him that way. Instead, he described his role as someone trying to contribute within his capacity, while continuously learning. His expression was serious, and his eyes briefly scanned the panel before settling back on Sunny Hostin, signaling that he was addressing the table as a whole, not just one person. The pacing of the segment slowed, a sign that producers were allowing the moment to breathe. On daytime talk shows, this usually happens when a conversation resonates with the audience, and this one clearly did. The studio remained quiet, attentive, with no distractions or side conversations. Even viewers at home could likely feel that this was one of those unscripted moments that make live television compelling. Sunny Hostin responded by clarifying that her questions were not meant to single him out, but to reflect broader conversations happening among viewers and commentators. She spoke about the responsibility of asking tough questions, especially when the platform allows for meaningful dialogue rather than sound bites. Her body language relaxed slightly, shoulders easing back, which subtly softened the exchange. DiCaprio acknowledged that clarification, and in doing so, his own posture eased a bit as well. He explained that he values these kinds of discussions precisely because they challenge him and others to think more critically. His voice, while still firm, carried a note of openness, suggesting that he saw the exchange as constructive rather than adversarial. Another host stepped in to summarize what had been said so far, a common technique used to reset the conversation and ensure viewers are following along. She highlighted the shared ground between DiCaprio and Sunny Hostin, emphasizing that both were ultimately talking about impact and responsibility, even if they approached it from different angles. This summary seemed to ease the room further, and the audience responded with light applause. Sunny Hostin nodded in agreement with the summary, then added one final point in this portion of the conversation. She spoke about the importance of transparency, especially in an era where audiences have access to more information than ever before. Her tone was thoughtful, less challenging than before, but still serious. It was clear that she wanted to leave viewers with something to think about, not just react to. DiCaprio's reply was concise but direct. He stated that transparency is essential and that public figures should expect scrutiny as part of their role. He also noted that conversations like the one happening at the table are part of that transparency, allowing viewers to see nuance rather than polished statements. His words landed with a sense of finality, not because the discussion was over, but because he had clearly articulated his position. The audience reacted with a longer round of applause, signaling appreciation for the exchange itself. On live television, applause like this often reflects not agreement with one side, but respect for a thoughtful conversation. Sunny Hostin smiled briefly, then thanked DiCaprio for engaging so openly. Her tone at this moment was warm, signaling that the tension had peaked and was now easing. As the segment prepared to transition into the next phase, the hosts adjusted their posture, and DiCaprio took a small sip of water, a natural pause that often accompanies a shift in topics. The atmosphere in the studio felt balanced again, serious but calm, with no lingering sense of conflict. For viewers watching at home, part 2 of this exchange likely felt like the heart of the discussion. It showed how a daytime talk show can handle disagreement without raising voices or resorting to dramatics. The firmness in DiCaprio's responses and the persistence in Sunny Hostin's questions created a moment that felt authentic, reflective, and grounded in real concerns. As the cameras stayed focused on the table, it was clear that while the conversation had been tense at moments, it remained respectful throughout. The groundwork was now set for the discussion to either broaden further or begin winding down, depending on how the hosts chose to guide it next. Either way, the exchange had already left an impression, both in the studio and among viewers following along in real time. As the conversation continued into its next stretch, there was a noticeable effort by the hosts to widen the lens, bringing the discussion back to a place that felt inclusive and accessible to viewers at home. This is often how daytime talk shows manage moments of tension, not by shutting them down, but by contextualizing them. One of the hosts shifted the focus slightly, referencing how audiences often feel overwhelmed by big issues like climate responsibility, public influence, and accountability, and how conversations like this can either empower or discourage people depending on how they're framed. Leonardo DiCaprio listened closely, his posture steady, hands resting calmly on the table. His facial expression was neutral but attentive, suggesting that he understood the importance of where the conversation was headed. Sunny Hostin also appeared thoughtful, glancing briefly toward the audience before returning her attention to DiCaprio, as if acknowledging that the discussion wasn't just between them, but involved everyone watching. The host, who had broadened the topic, asked DiCaprio how he approaches communicating complex issues without alienating people who may already feel fatigued or skeptical. The question was phrased carefully, and its tone was neutral, offering DiCaprio an opportunity to reflect rather than defend. This shift slightly diffused the intensity that had built earlier, while still keeping the conversation substantive. DiCaprio responded by speaking about the importance of tone and accessibility. He explained that when he talks about issues he cares deeply about, he tries to meet people where they are, rather than assuming a shared level of understanding or urgency. His voice was calm, and he spoke at a measured pace, which matched the overall atmosphere of the studio at that moment. The audience remained quiet, listening closely, with the occasional nod visible in the front rows. Sunny Hostin then re-entered the conversation, not with a challenge this time, but with a reflective observation. She noted that many viewers appreciate when public figures acknowledge uncertainty and complexity rather than presenting themselves as authorities on every aspect of an issue. Her tone was softer than earlier, and her body language reflected that shift, shoulders relaxed, hands loosely folded. DiCaprio acknowledged her point, agreeing that no one person has all the answers. He emphasized that collaboration with experts and communities is essential, and that his role is often to help amplify those voices rather than replace them. This response seemed to resonate with the audience, who responded with a brief, polite round of applause. As the conversation unfolded, another host added a comment about how moments like these, when perspectives are examined openly on live television, can model respectful disagreement for viewers. This comment subtly reframed the earlier tension as something constructive rather than uncomfortable. Sunny Hostin nodded in agreement, and DiCaprio offered a small smile, acknowledging the sentiment. The pacing of the segment remained steady, with no one rushing to speak over another. This calm rhythm allowed viewers to absorb the nuances of the discussion. On daytime talk shows, this kind of pacing often signals that producers are comfortable letting the conversation unfold naturally, trusting that the audience is engaged. Sunny Hostin then posed a more personal question, asking DiCaprio how he handles criticism, especially when it comes from people who question his motives or consistency. Her tone was inquisitive rather than confrontational, and she framed the question as something many public figures struggle with. The shift toward personal reflection marked another evolution in the conversation. DiCaprio paused briefly before answering, a thoughtful silence that stood out in the live broadcast. He spoke about learning to separate constructive criticism from noise, and about the importance of self-reflection without becoming paralyzed by scrutiny. His response was candid but controlled, offering insight without oversharing. The audience remained engaged, with a few audible murmurs of agreement. Sunny Hostin responded by acknowledging the difficulty of maintaining that balance, especially in the public eye. She shared a brief observation about how even journalists and hosts face similar challenges, though on a different scale. This moment of shared experience helped further humanize the exchange, reminding viewers that the conversation was grounded in real-life pressures, not abstract arguments. Another host took the opportunity to summarize this portion of the discussion, highlighting themes of responsibility, humility, and dialogue. This recap served as a natural checkpoint, ensuring that viewers joining mid-segment could follow along. It also reinforced the idea that while there had been moments of firmness and tension, the overall exchange remained respectful and productive. DiCaprio nodded as the summary was delivered, and Sunny Hostin offered a brief verbal affirmation, signaling agreement. The studio audience responded with light applause, a sign that the conversation was landing well. The atmosphere felt balanced, with no sense that anyone had won or lost, but rather that something meaningful had been explored. As the segment edged closer to its latter half, the hosts began to subtly prepare for a transition, adjusting their notes and glancing toward the cameras. However, before moving on, Sunny Hostin added one final reflection in this part of the conversation. She spoke about the value of accountability conversations happening in public spaces, even when they're uncomfortable, because they encourage growth rather than complacency. DiCaprio responded with a firm but appreciative tone, thanking her for raising those points. He emphasized that open dialogue is essential, especially on platforms that reach diverse audiences. His words were deliberate, and his expression was sincere, suggesting that he recognized the importance of the moment beyond the immediate exchange. The audience reacted with a longer, sustained round of applause, indicating that viewers in the studio felt the conversation had reached a meaningful place. Sunny Hostin smiled briefly and nodded, acknowledging the response. The other hosts also appeared satisfied, their expressions relaxed and engaged. For viewers at home, this part of the segment likely felt like a turning point. The earlier tension had evolved into mutual understanding, without either side retreating from their core perspectives. It demonstrated how firm responses and persistent questions can coexist without devolving into conflict, a hallmark of well-managed live television. As the cameras held on the table and the hosts prepared to move forward, the energy in the studio felt steady and thoughtful. The discussion had matured, setting the stage for either a wrap-up or a broader reflection in the final portion of the segment. What remained clear was that this exchange had captured attention not through drama, but through sincerity, clarity, and the willingness of both Leonardo DiCaprio and Sunny Hostin to engage openly on live television. As the segment moved further along, the hosts began to gently guide the conversation toward reflection rather than challenge, a shift that regular viewers of daytime talk shows would recognize as a way to bring discussions full circle. The intensity that had surfaced earlier did not disappear entirely, but it settled into something more measured. The studio atmosphere felt steady, focused, and attentive, with the audience clearly invested in where the conversation was going next. One of the hosts introduced a broader question about public discourse, asking how conversations like the one unfolding at the table influence the way audiences talk about serious issues in their own lives. The question was framed in a way that invited both DiCaprio and Sunny Hostin to reflect, rather than defend. This approach allowed the discussion to remain meaningful without reigniting tension. DiCaprio responded first, speaking about the responsibility of tone in public conversations. He explained that when discussions remain respectful, even in disagreement, they can encourage people to engage rather than withdraw. His voice was calm and even, and his body language reflected that steadiness. He leaned slightly forward as he spoke, a subtle sign of engagement, then relaxed back into his seat as he finished his thought. Sunny Hostin followed, offering her perspective on the role of questioning in public forums. She spoke about how asking direct questions, even when they create moments of discomfort, can help clarify positions and build trust with audiences. Her tone was thoughtful, and there was no sharpness in her delivery. Instead, it felt reflective, as if she were speaking as much to viewers at home as to the guest beside her. The other hosts nodded along, occasionally adding brief affirmations or paraphrasing points to ensure clarity. These small contributions helped maintain the flow of the conversation and reinforced the sense of collective engagement at the table. The audience remained quiet, listening closely, with only the occasional soft reaction when a point resonated. DiCaprio then addressed the idea of firmness, indirectly referencing the earlier moments in the segment without explicitly calling them out. He spoke about how standing by one's values does not require raising one's voice or dismissing others. His words seemed carefully chosen, and his expression suggested he was aware that viewers might be interpreting his responses as firm but controlled. This acknowledgement added a layer of self-awareness to his presence on the show. Sunny Hostin responded with a brief nod and a measured smile, signaling understanding. She added that firmness and openness are not mutually exclusive, especially in conversations meant to inform rather than persuade. Her delivery was calm, and her posture remained relaxed, indicating that the earlier tension had fully transitioned into dialogue. At this point, the studio audience offered a short burst of applause, not loud or prolonged, but affirming. On daytime television, applause like this often reflects appreciation for the tone of the discussion rather than agreement with any single point. The hosts acknowledged it with small smiles before continuing. Another host then steered the conversation toward how viewers interpret these exchanges. She mentioned that social media often amplifies moments of tension without capturing the full context, and asked both DiCaprio and Hostin how they feel about conversations being reduced to short clips. This question introduced a meta layer to the discussion, reflecting the realities of modern media consumption. DiCaprio responded by acknowledging the challenge, noting that context can easily be lost when moments are isolated. He emphasized the importance of full conversations, where nuance has room to exist. His tone remained steady, and he spoke without urgency, suggesting that this was an issue he had considered carefully over time. Sunny Hostin added that while short clips can spark interest, they rarely tell the whole story. She spoke about the responsibility of both media creators and consumers to seek context before forming conclusions. Her remarks were delivered evenly, with no sense of defensiveness, reinforcing the collaborative tone that had emerged. The audience reacted with murmurs of agreement, a low, collective response that underscored the relevance of the point. The hosts allowed a brief pause, letting the reaction settle before continuing. These pauses are often intentional on live television, giving weight to what has just been said. As the conversation progressed, one of the hosts summarized the key themes that had emerged: accountability, tone, context, and engagement. This summary served as a bridge toward wrapping up the segment, reminding viewers of the journey the discussion had taken. Both DiCaprio and Sunny Hostin listened attentively, nodding occasionally. Sunny Hostin then offered a closing reflection for her part, speaking about the value of having guests who are willing to engage thoughtfully, even when questions are challenging. Her tone was sincere, and she looked directly at DiCaprio as she spoke. This moment felt like a clear acknowledgement that the firmness in his responses had been received as engagement, not resistance. DiCaprio thanked her for the conversation, expressing appreciation for the opportunity to discuss complex issues in a public, respectful setting. His response was brief but genuine, and it carried a sense of closure for the exchange between them. The audience responded with warm applause, louder than before, signaling approval of how the discussion had unfolded. The hosts began to prepare for the final moments of the segment, glancing at their notes and the studio monitors. The energy in the room felt settled and reflective, with no lingering discomfort. What remained was a sense that viewers had witnessed a real, unscripted exchange that stayed within the bounds of daytime television while still addressing meaningful topics. For those watching at home, this part of the segment likely reinforced the idea that firmness does not have to mean confrontation. The discussion had moved from tension to understanding without losing substance, a balance that is not always easy to achieve on live TV. As the segment neared its conclusion, it was clear that both Leonardo DiCaprio and Sunny Hostin had contributed to a conversation that felt honest, grounded, and thoughtfully managed. With the final portion still to come, the hosts appeared ready to bring the discussion to a close, aware that the exchange had already made its impression. The audience remained attentive, and the overall tone suggested that the segment would end not with drama, but with reflection and response, both in the studio and beyond. As the segment entered its final moments, there was a noticeable shift in how everyone at the table carried themselves. The conversation had reached a natural point of resolution, and the hosts began signaling, both verbally and through body language, that they were preparing to wrap things up. On live daytime television, these transitions are subtle but familiar to regular viewers. The tone was calm, reflective, and settled, with no urgency or lingering tension. One of the hosts thanked Leonardo DiCaprio for staying engaged throughout a wide-ranging discussion, framing the exchange as an example of how complex topics can be addressed respectfully on live TV. Her voice was warm and steady, and she briefly glanced toward the audience, acknowledging their attentiveness. DiCaprio responded with a nod and a brief expression of appreciation, his posture relaxed, hands resting naturally on the table. Sunny Hostin was given the final word from the panel, and her delivery reflected the journey the conversation had taken. She spoke about the importance of dialogue that allows room for disagreement without losing mutual respect. Her tone was measured and thoughtful, and she made it clear that her questions were rooted in curiosity and accountability rather than criticism. This clarification felt intentional, aimed not just at DiCaprio, but at viewers who had been following closely. DiCaprio responded one last time, briefly but firmly, reiterating that he welcomed those kinds of questions and believed they were necessary in public conversations. His voice was calm, but his words carried clarity and conviction. He emphasized that progress often comes from discussions that challenge assumptions while remaining grounded in respect. There was no attempt to revisit earlier points or reframe the exchange. Instead, his response felt like a closing statement, concise and composed. The studio audience reacted with sustained applause, louder and longer than earlier in the segment. This reaction suggested appreciation for the overall tone and substance of the conversation rather than agreement with any single viewpoint. The host smiled and waited for the applause to settle, allowing the moment to land before moving on. As the applause faded, the show transitioned smoothly, with the hosts thanking DiCaprio again and teasing the next segment. The cameras briefly lingered on the table, capturing relaxed expressions and subtle nods exchanged among the hosts and their guest. There was no awkwardness, no visible strain. Everything about the ending suggested that the exchange had concluded cleanly and professionally. Once the episode aired, viewer reactions began to surface almost immediately. On social media, clips from the segment circulated, particularly moments where DiCaprio responded firmly to Sunny Hostin's questions. Some viewers focused on his measured tone, praising him for staying calm and articulate under scrutiny. Others highlighted Sunny Hostin's persistence, noting that her questions reflected conversations many people were already having at home. Commentators pointed out that the exchange stood out precisely because it wasn't explosive. Instead of raised voices or sharp interruptions, viewers saw a slow build of tension followed by thoughtful engagement. Many described it as a reminder of what daytime talk shows can offer when discussions are allowed to unfold naturally rather than being rushed or sensationalized. In follow-up discussions on television and online, hosts and media analysts referenced the segment as an example of firm disagreement handled appropriately. Some noted how the pacing of the conversation allowed both perspectives to be heard fully. Others emphasized how the studio audience's reactions played a role in shaping the tone, reinforcing moments of clarity and mutual respect. Sunny Hostin addressed the segment briefly on a later episode, reiterating that her intention was to ask questions viewers care about, even when those questions are challenging. She described the exchange as productive and expressed appreciation for DiCaprio's willingness to engage without deflecting. Her remarks were brief but clear, reinforcing the idea that there was no personal conflict behind the on-air firmness. DiCaprio, in a separate interview days later, was asked about the appearance. He described it as a meaningful conversation and acknowledged that live television brings a unique kind of honesty to discussions. He did not single out any host by name, instead speaking broadly about the value of being challenged in public forums. His comments aligned with how the segment had ended, reinforcing consistency between what viewers saw on air and what followed afterward. For many viewers, the lasting impression of the segment wasn't a single quote or moment, but the overall experience of watching a real conversation unfold in real time. It demonstrated how disagreement can exist without turning personal, and how firmness can be expressed without hostility. In a media environment often driven by extremes, that stood out. Inside the studio, audience members later described the atmosphere as attentive and respectful. Some noted that the applause at the end felt genuine, not prompted, reflecting appreciation for the discussion itself. These reactions echoed what many viewers at home expressed online, suggesting that the segment resonated beyond the immediate broadcast. As the show moved on to other topics, the DiCaprio and Hostin exchange continued to circulate, not as a viral controversy, but as a reference point in conversations about media, accountability, and public dialogue. It became one of those moments that people return to when discussing how talk shows can handle serious subjects without sacrificing civility. In the end, the segment closed the way it began, with professionalism and balance. What started as a routine appearance evolved into a firm but respectful exchange, handled carefully by both the guest and the hosts. It reminded viewers that live television still has the power to capture authentic moments, not because they are dramatic, but because they are real. And now, after hearing the full story of how Leonardo DiCaprio responded firmly to Sunny Hostin on a daytime talk show, it's your turn to weigh in. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories that walk you through what really happens on live television.